and literally hundreds of millions of dollars over the years have been spent by the U.S. government in grants for evolutionary-type research based on the uniformitarian principle, based on an evolutionary view of Earth's history, based on an evolutionary view of the origin of life. In fact, that's the reason why some of the space probes have been sent to some of the planets, is to look for the pre-life precursors. And of course, as you well know, they have all failed. In any event, the falsification test of the trial was simply said to be meaningless, and the halos, the polonium halos, the ones that we talked about tonight, which are on the front cover, one of which is on the front cover of my book, was said to be a tiny mystery which scientists would someday solve. Well, of course, when I finally got around to writing the book, I couldn't think of any better title than Creation's Tiny Mystery. Well, my testimony, which occurred during the second week of the trial, I presented in great detail 4 hours worth of testimony, the scientific reports, the scientific evidence, and it was all over, except for the reverberations. The reverberations came, first of all, in the decision. The judge's decision there completely ignored, almost completely ignored the evidence for creation which I had presented in the court. In fact, if you ever get the book, you'll see that the cross-examination related almost entirely to things that were not germane to the falsification test or to the scientific evidence. It was brought out that I indeed believe the Bible, for example. In other words, at that particular time, the questions related to one of the questions in the cross-examination related specifically as to whether indeed I believe the Bible. Whereas I had spent 4 hours talking about the scientific evidence, when the American Civil Liberties Union began to cross-examine me, it was to a large extent not about the scientific evidence, not about the falsification test, not about whether indeed the polonium halos had another alternative explanation within conventional science, but relating to peripheral issues, of course, to divert attention away from the main theme of the evidence for creation. The judge ruled in favor of the ACLU. The law was struck down. A few weeks later, after the trial, of course, I was back here. I was back away from the trial itself in my home, and I picked up a scientific magazine and began to read the account of the trial, January 1st issue, January 8th issue. And I saw some things which, first of all, I saw were not an accurate representation of my work at all. In fact, in my opinion, it misrepresented what I had said, and most of all, it left out the most important part, that indeed science, creation science is science because I have proposed a falsification test. If I'm simply up here tonight saying I found a piece of rock and it's a piece of created rock, then that doesn't mean anything. If I don't propose a test, a way in which we can decide one between the other, it's not science. Well, I explained this all in great detail there at the court, and the science reporter who was there at the trial made no mention of the falsification test. In fact, as I've indicated to you, I felt that some of the things he had said were quite inaccurate. And as a result of that, a situation which I had enjoyed great cordiality over a 12-and-a-half-year period of time began to change, and I noticed a variation in people's attitudes and their comments, but it's something that didn't surprise me. The spring then of 1982, I was still working and doing research in this area, the laboratory, and I was still doing research relating to things that I felt were of other significance than just creation per se. There was a report that I was working on relative to nuclear wastes. And in fact, I was the author, co-author at least, the lead author of a report that was published in April of 1982 concerning the long-term storage of nuclear wastes. Now, normally, this is what laboratories exist for, people to do research and people to publish their findings. In this particular instance, the topic of the paper that I had published was interesting for more than one reason. Nuclear waste, at that time, had just come to the attention of the U.S. Senate. Another bill or amendment was going to be introduced at the Senate. Some senators found out about the report that had just been published, And this report that was published on April 16, 1982, came to the attention of the U.S. Senate, and in fact was brought to the floor of the U.S. Senate. And here in my book, I relate what is now what has been in the congressional record since April 30, 1982. Senator Thad Cochran of Mississippi, got up on the Senate floor, and I'll let you read what he says, but the comments were complimentary, and the report itself was reprinted in the congressional record of April 30, 1982. As a result of that, some other things happened. Senator Jim Sasser, in fact, his aide wrote me a letter telling me how they appreciated the input that I had through this report to the debate there on nuclear waste in the Senate in April 1982. A few weeks after, it was about a week after this point, he wrote me a letter. And he asked me if there was anything that he could do for me, not knowing what was happening. And by this time, I'd been told that my position at the laboratory was going to be terminated. So I wrote him a letter. I said, sure, there's something you can do. I've been doing research here for a long time. I want to keep on doing research. I want you to intervene. But anyway, nothing happened. And June 30, 1982, I was no longer with the laboratory. So I continued my work at home like I had begun 20 years earlier. And the work progresses very, very slowly. And then that fall, since funds were low again and I was running out of everything and had very few friends, I looked around for a teaching position. In fact, I looked for a teaching position in the Knoxville area. And there was a university in the Knoxville area, if you can believe it, that hired me to teach for the fall semester of 1982 in the math department. Well, in December 1982, Governor Lamar Alexander, as you may or may not remember, said we've got a budget crisis and crunch, and so all the temporary teachers who had been hired at the beginning of the academic year 1982 are going to have to be axed. And I was one of them. So January 1983, I had nothing again, supposedly. But then an individual who barely knew me came forward and said, well, you've got an interesting story if you don't have anything else. And he said, I think it needs to be put down. He said, I'll give you some money to begin writing a book. I said, great. So I began to write the book. His money gave out, and somebody else came along and said, we want to help you finish the book. And I said, wonderful. My wife was especially overjoyed with these prospects. In any event, 1984 came and I was working on the book. And the National Academy of Sciences, as you well know, this question of teaching creation science in the public schools has been on the burner because, you see, in 1982, after the Arkansas law was shot down, Louisiana came forth and they said, we want creation science taught in the public schools. And the ACLU came into the picture again, and as you may or may not know, it's been through the courts. The Louisiana law now went through the courts. The judge said, first of all, the law is not going to be enforced, can't be enforced, or is unconstitutional, or words to that effect. And it went through the state courts, and then it went to the federal district, went to Court of Appeals. But finally, the Supreme Court decided to hear the case. And just last December 10, up in Washington, the Supreme Court heard arguments on the constitutionality of the teaching of creation science via the Louisiana law. And that law, or I should say the court, is presently writing its opinion tomorrow, next week, next month. Sometime between now and July, the court is going to render an opinion as to whether the Louisiana creation science law is constitutional or whether it will go back to the court to be tried there in the state of Louisiana. But, getting ahead of my story, going back to 1984, the National Academy of Sciences, whom, as you probably well know, is composed of the most eminent scientists in America, published a booklet, Science and Creationism, A View from the National Academy of Sciences. And in this booklet, they come across very, very strongly to the effect that there is no science in creation science. Absolutely no science in creation science. In fact, they make some comments about, very specifically, the Genesis record of creation. And they don't leave any doubt that they're talking about creation science in the context of the Bible and the 6 days of creation and so forth. Well, as I was writing my book, I decided I wanted to respond, because they said there was no evidence for creation science, and every time evidence for creation had been examined, it had always been found to be invalid. So I commented on that as I was writing my book. But last August, I was invited to go up to Pittsburgh